The blistering sun of Mexico City beats down on a remote corner of the airport where rows of sleek modern airliners sit silently in the heat. These aren't rusted relics from the 1970s. Some of these jets are less than 7 years old, with fresh paint and interiors designed by the same people who style Ferraris, yet they are rusting in the sun. Why would a fleet of cutting-edge aircraft worth hundreds of millions of dollars be abandoned like trash in the desert while the rest of the world is desperate for planes? Here is the twist. These aren't failed prototypes from a garage startup, but the Superjet 100, an aircraft certified by Europe and meant to prove Russia could beat Boeing and Airbus. So, how did a plane championed by Vladimir Putin become a poison pill for every airline that touched it? Was it a failure of engineering, or something far more sinister buried in the supply chain that turned a project designed to save Russia's aviation industry into the very thing that destroyed it? Here is what is really happening. Past the busy terminals where Boeings and Airbuses are taxiing for takeoff, at the far edge of the airfield lies a boneyard, where a tragedy in aluminum sits buried beneath layers of dust and neglect. Dozens of Interjet aircraft are parked wingtip to wingtip. In the aviation world, you usually see this sight when planes reach the end of their lives. Old birds that have flown for 20 or 30 years and are retired to the desert to be scrapped. But if you look closer, you will see that these planes are not old. In fact, some of them are practically infants in aviation terms, ranging from just 2 to 7 years old. Their livery is still bright and their engines look pristine, yet they are rusting in the sun. This is not a scene of normal retirement. This is a disaster site of industrial ambition. These jets are not obscure prototypes from a garage inventor. This is the Sukhoi Superjet 100, the aircraft that was certified by the highest European authorities and praised by the glossy aviation magazines as a game changer. It was the machine personally championed by Vladimir Putin as the symbol of a new, rising Russia. It was designed to be the anti-Soviet jet that would prove to the world that Russia could play by Western rules, building a sleek, efficient, comfortable airliner that would steal customers away from Embraer and Bombardier. Instead, it became a Frankenstein creation that stitched together the worst impulses of Russian bureaucracy with the extreme fragility of Western technology. The stakes here are massive because this is not just a story about a bad plane. It is the story of how a superpower imagined its own comeback. It is the story of a nation that tried to buy a reputation instead of building one, and how that pride led to a fleet of ghost planes haunting a runway in Mexico. To understand how Russia ended up in this trap, we have to go back to the collapse. The 1990s were a time of absolute chaos for Russian aviation. When the Soviet Union fell apart, its massive state airline, Aeroflot, shattered into hundreds of tiny, unsafe carriers that people called the baby flots. The skies over Russia became a terrifying place as the fleet was made up of Soviet-era metal, Tupolevs and Ilyushins that were loud, smoky, and dangerously inefficient. They used fuel like it was water and belched black smoke that you could see from miles away, making Russian aviation a global joke and a symbol of danger. Then came the mid-2000s when oil prices were skyrocketing and the Kremlin was flush with cash. Vladimir Putin wanted Russia back on the world stage, and he knew that a superpower is not real if it cannot build its own airplanes. He issued a mandate to create the United Aircraft Corporation, or UAC, to bring the fractured industry under one roof. However, they hit a massive identity crisis immediately. The chosen champion for this new project was Sukhoi, a name famous for building some of the most dangerous, maneuverable fighter jets on Earth, like the Su-27. They are masters of war, but they had zero experience building planes for paying passengers who wanted legroom and air conditioning rather than ejection seats. The executives at Sukhoi realized a hard truth. They could not sell a Russian plane to the world because the brand was toxic. Western passengers associated Russian jets with cramped cabins and questionable safety records, so they devised a strategy that seemed brilliant at the time. To sell a Russian plane, they decided to make it appear not Russian. They went on a global shopping spree, hiring Pininfarina, the legendary Italian firm that designs Ferraris, to style the cabin interiors so passengers would feel like they were in Milan, not Moscow. They hired Liebherr from Germany to build the flight controls and Thales from France to create the avionics. The goal was bold. They would build a Western jet with Western comfort and Western technology, but they would assemble it in Komsomolsk-on-Amur, deep in the Russian Far East, increased, creating what was supposed to be the best of both worlds. But every tragedy has a fatal flaw, and for the Superjet, that flaw was hidden in the engines. Sukhoi needed a power system that was efficient and reliable, so they struck a deal with Safran, the French aerospace giant that makes engines for the Boeing 737. It seemed like a huge win because this was validation from the highest level of the Western aerospace industry. They formed a joint venture called Powerjet, and the way they split the work on the SAM 146 engine was almost poetic and deeply clear about what was coming. Russia would build the cold section, which is the fan at the front, and the low-pressure compressor, because Russia is famous for heavy metal and is good at forging big, durable chunks of steel. France would build the hot section, the high-pressure core where the air is compressed and ignited. This is the brain and heart of the engine, requiring high-tech alloys and microscopic precision. The selling point was enticing because this was supposed to be the perfect marriage of Russian durability, protecting French efficiency, a tank wrapped around a supercomputer. But the engineers on the ground saw the warning signs immediately. They warned management that mixing two completely different aerospace styles was a recipe for disaster. The Russian approach to engineering is about ruggedness, loose fits, and heavy materials designed to be fixed with a hammer in a freezing hangar, while the Western approach is about precision, using delicate materials designed to be maintained in a clean environment. Combining them in a single engine was a ticking time bomb, but the executives were too busy celebrating in Paris and Moscow to listen because they had their deal and their plane. The pressure to perform was crushing by 2012 when the Superjet was ready for its world tour. They took it to Indonesia for a demonstration flight with the goal of dazzling Asian buyers and showing them that this new Russian jet could handle the humid tropics just as well as the Siberian cold. But on May 9th, disaster struck. The pilot was Alexander Yablontsev, a cosmonaut and a hero test pilot. But even heroes have egos. He was under immense pressure to show off the plane's capabilities, so as he navigated near Mount Salak, the aircraft's terrain warning system began to warn him to pull up. In a Western cockpit, that warning is a strict command you obey instantly. But Yablontsev, perhaps believing it was a glitch or trusting his own eyes over the instruments, ignored the warnings and kept flying. The Superjet slammed into the side of the volcano, claiming the lives of 45 people. While the investigation officially ruled it as pilot error, it revealed the rot inside the program culture where they were rushing and desperate for validation. They were flying dangerous routes in unfamiliar terrain just to sell a few units. Amazingly, they pushed through because the political machine was too strong to stop. Despite the crash, they secured certification from ESA, the European Aviation Safety Agency, and set up a headquarters in Venice, Italy. They marketed the Superjet not as a Russian plane, but as a European one, pretending to be something they were not. The plane entered service, and at first, pilots actually liked it because it flew well, was responsive, and was comfortable. But then, the boring reality of aviation set in. The thing that destroys airlines is not usually crashes, it is logistics. When a part breaks on a Boeing 737, the airline calls a distribution center, and usually within 24 hours, a replacement part arrives on the next flight, so the plane is fixed and back in the air making money. When a part broke on a Superjet, the nightmare began. The request would go to the headquarters in Venice, then might be routed to Moscow due to red tape, then to the factory in Siberia, and finally, customs had to get involved. A simple sensor replacement that should take an afternoon began to take weeks or sometimes months. An airplane that is sitting on the ground is not an asset, it is a liability that burns cash. Then, the engines started to eat themselves. Remember the perfect marriage of the Powerjet engine? The French hot section began cracking after only a fraction of its promised life. The French had designed the engine liners for the clean runways of Europe, but the Superjet was flying in Russia and Mexico, where it was inhaling dust, grit, and pollution. The delicate French alloys couldn't handle the rough reality. The brochure promised the engine would stay on the wing for up to 16,000 cycles, but in reality, engines were being pulled off for major repairs after only 1,000 to 4,000 cycles. It was a huge failure of engineering judgment, but here is where it gets even crazier. Because the engine core was French property, Russian mechanics were legally forbidden to open it. They could stare at the engine and knew how to fix it, but they were not allowed to touch it. They had to crate the entire engine up and ship it all the way back to France for repairs. The repair line in France grew longer and longer, and with no spare engines available, airlines were left with brand new jets sitting on the tarmac missing their engines while waiting for a slot in a French workshop. This logistical mess claimed its first major victim, Interjet. Interjet was a low-cost Mexican carrier with big dreams that bought 22 Superjets. They were the poster child for the program, the proof that a Western airline would trust Russian metal. By 2018, Interjet was in a crisis because the engines were failing left and right. They couldn't afford the repairs or the wait times, and they were losing money fast. So they did the unthinkable. To keep a small number of their planes flying, they began to strip their own fleet for parts. They would tow a perfectly good jet into the hangar and take the engines, the computers, and the landing gear to install them on another jet just to get it in the air. At one point, Interjet had reduced its operational fleet to a skeleton crew, with the majority of their brand new planes sitting as hollow shells in the boneyard. The Superjet issues made the airline's financial difficulties much worse, adding to their debt and ruining their reputation with passengers who were tired of cancellations. Interjet eventually went bankrupt. Other airlines saw this horror show and ran for the exits. CityJet in Ireland, the only European operator, returned their planes. The Superjet was officially dead in the Western market because no one would touch it. But if the story ended there, it would just be a business failure. In 2022, it became a geopolitical disaster. When Russian tanks rolled across the border in February 2022, the West responded with the most crushing aviation sanctions in history. Boeing and Airbus cut off support immediately. But Sukhoi thought they were safe because this was a Russian plane, right? Wrong. The westernization strategy that was supposed to save them now came back to haunt them because overnight, 70 to 80% of the Superjet became banned items. Safran stopped supporting the engines, Michelin stopped sending tires, and Honeywell cut off the electronics. The French and German partners packed up and left. The irony was blinding. The plane designed to make Russia independent was grounded because it was addicted to Western parts. The Kremlin went into panic mode and announced the SSJ New project, declaring they would replace every single Western screw, wire, and sensor with a Russian-made alternative. Think about the size of that task. They are trying to replicate 30 years of global aerospace research in just 2 years. They are developing the PD-8 engine to replace the French one, but reports indicate it is heavier, less efficient, and still being tested. In the meantime, the safety situation is becoming critical as reports have emerged of Russian airlines dealing with body defects and mid-air incidents. They are resorting to stripping planes for parts on a massive scale just to keep the domestic fleet moving, flying planes with expired parts because they have no other choice. This brings us back to the boneyard in Mexico. The wind blows through the turbines of jets that were supposed to conquer the world, standing as a monument to a specific kind of failure. Putin wanted a shortcut. He thought that by buying French engines and Italian interiors, he could buy Western respect. He thought he could dress up a Russian industrial project in a designer suit and fool the market. But aviation is the ultimate truth teller because gravity does not care about your marketing budget and physics does not care about your political goals. The failure of the Superjet proves that you cannot buy a reputation, you have to build it. By outsourcing the hard parts, the engines and the avionics, Russia admitted decades ago that they couldn't compete, and when the geopolitical walls went up, that admission turned into a prison. Check out another video here.